Containers is probably a technology you've been hearing a lot about, but how easy is it to get started and why would you want to run SQL Server 2019 in a container? This week on Data Exposed. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed MVP Edition. Today, I'm joined by Anthony Nocentino from Centino Systems. Anthony, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Anna. I'm real excited to be here.
We're always excited to have you. And, before we get into it, I wanted to just ask you to tell us a little bit about what you do.
So, Anna, I'm Anthony Nocentino. I'm the consultant and trainer at Centino Systems, and I specialize in system architecture and performance. So I like to design systems, and I like to make things go fast.
Awesome. Making things go fast. Sounds like a pretty good time. And today we're going to talk about containers and maybe something about how containers go fast. But before we get into it, I wanted to ask you, what is a container and why do these things exist now?
Sure. A container is kind of a new way to deploy an application. And so let's kind of walk through what that looks like. So in a data center, you might have a physical or a virtual computer, and we'll put just a regular host operating system on top of that, whether it's Linux or Windows. And then from there, that's where things get unique. Well, traditionally, we would install our applications directly onto the OS. But with a container is going to be a binary image of our application, and all of its dependencies kind of self-contained in this unit. And today, we're going to be talking about SQL Server and SQL Server 2019. And so we can deploy SQL Server as a container inside of an operating system to consume the underlying resources of that OS. And then we can go about and deploy even more containers, so another SQL Server or perhaps even another application, and build more complex systems with containers using that same underlying OS. And what's neat about this is it gives us the ability to kind of decouple the configuration of our applications and the state of our applications, because the container becomes the unit of deployment. And what that means is, let's say I need to come out with a new version of my application, or a new cumulative update for SQL comes along. Well, since we've decoupled the configuration and the state of our application from the deployment of our application by using containers, I can do something like this. I can literally delete my container and redeploy that container on that new version. I use that same configuration. I point the application to where the existing data was, and I'm back up and running. New version of my application, but I've maintained the configuration and the state of my application independent of the running of my application.
Awesome. That's pretty cool. So, there's a lot of different ways I can run SQL Server. Why, containers are cool, but why would I want to run on a container?
So great question. So why do you want to run SQL Server in containers? It's going to come down to this: speed and consistency, being able to do things quickly and do them over and over in a repeatable way, because that's going to enable us to be able to build deployment automation. So in traditional IT deployment systems, we spent a lot of time building our environment and cultivating and maintaining that environment. Now with containers, we're going to be able to write code to deploy our applications so that we can do that quickly in a repeatable way. Because no matter how good we are as humans, we're slower than a computer, and we'll definitely make more mistakes than a computer will if we run our applications manually and deploy those manually. But if we write code to do that, we can do that quickly and consistently. Now, that's going to enable us to start maturing our platforms so we can start doing more complicated things like DevOps scenarios using continuous integration and continuous deployment, being able to build our application in a repeatable way and deploy our application in a repeatable way. And as we kind of go along in the story of why, we're going to see as new things come out from Microsoft specifically that we're able to use containers as a building block to build more complex systems. And so you see things like big data clusters or Azure Arc data services, and those are using containers as the building block to build more complex solutions. And the way that it gets done is in code. And that's one of the ways that Microsoft is able to deploy those complex systems to you in a controlled way, is to give you the code to deploy those systems. And so the container being the building block underneath that. And one of the key elements for me when I started working with containers is we're going to rethink how we deploy our applications. For so long, were tied up into the server was the thing that I was deploying and protecting. And it's not. We're going to really be deploying the application or the service, right? Is there a SQL Server up and running for me to get access to that data? Or to rephrase that, is there a SQL Server container up and running that gets me access to that data? And you're going to see in a second when we do some demonstrations how quickly it is for me to deploy a container, delete that container, and replace it with a new one, getting me access back into my data quickly and consistently.
Awesome. This sounds really interesting. I'm really interested to see how easy it is to kind of get this thing up and running. And what I heard is you're actually going to use a PowerShell notebook. So I'm even more excited to see how you're going to get this thing up and running. So why don't you go ahead and show us what you got?
So here we are in an Azure Data Studio notebook, and let's walk through the process of deploying SQL Server in a container, creating the database, and then deploying a new version of SQL Server, accessing that same database. And to start up a container, it doesn't take that much code to do that. So here I have 7 lines of code to deploy SQL Server. And we start off by executing the command docker run. We give our container a name. In this case, it's SQL1. Now, here's an example of how to decouple configuration from the deployment of our actual application. And so we're injecting environment variables to assert some configuration onto our application, in this case, SQL Server. And so we're accepting the licensing agreement and injecting a password for our database system. We're going to make that container available on port 1433. And here's an example of how we're going to decouple the state of our application. We're going to expose a volume from our underlying operating system into the container. And so when SQL Server starts to work, it's going to read and write its data there. And that gives me the ability to take my container, throw it away, and put a new one in that same exact location to access that data again. On line 7 is the container image that I'm going to start up. And here you can see I'm using a container image for SQL Server 2019 CU4. So with an Azure Data Studio notebook, I press play, it'll run that code in that cell. I get a long container ID as output here at the bottom. Now, to see if my container is up and running, I can use the command docker ps, and that's going to give me a listing of the running containers that are running on my local system here. And it's up and running. And so you can think of this as the running application. This is just a container running on my underlying OS. And the key thing that I want to point out in this line of output is where the application is running. So in the column on the right there, we see that the application is running on all IP addresses, or 0.0.0 on port 1433, which means I can point any application on my network to that location to consume the services of this database. And so let's go ahead and do that. Let's run our first query against SQL Server deployed inside of a container. And I'm going to run a very simple query, select add version, and in the output there, you can see I'm running SQL Server 2019 CU4. And I did that in about 7 lines of code when we executed that docker run command. I've been deploying SQL Server for a long time, and it still gets me excited to see how I can deploy SQL Server that quickly and that consistently. So let's create a database inside of that running container. That's done, and check the output. And so there we see the 4 system databases associated with this particular SQL Server instance and the test database that we just created together. And so just to kind of go through the life cycle of killing an app, and to go through the life cycle of deployment, let's kill this container and deploy a new version of SQL Server. And so the way that we go about doing that is we can stop our running container with docker stop and then specifying the container name. And now I'm going to delete that container. And that's just going to delete the definition of the container from my system. What that means is I can come back and create another container and assert some configuration on that. So we're going to start off with docker run again. I'm going to give it the same name, SQL1, and inject some configuration. So accept the EULA and define an SA password. Now this is where it's key. We're going to access that same data location. So there you see the same volume that we created in the first container that we ran. The key difference between this execution and the previous execution is I've just upgraded SQL Server to CU5. And we did that in a very short amount of code here. Going down a little bit further, now that that container is up and running, I run the check add version again, and it still has to go through the upgrade process of moving from CU4 to CU5. And if I come back a few seconds later, you can see I'm already upgraded to CU5. And so that's a fantastic piece of functionality to be able to move between versions of SQL Server in a very quick and controlled way. If I run the check to see what databases are available on the system, there we see the the system databases that we had, and also that test database. So going through that life cycle, we started up a container, we created a database, we deleted the container, started up SQL Server on a new version of SQL Server, and we still have access to that data. Now, to kind of close it off here, if we stop that container just to shut it down again and remove its definition, that data is still on my underlying operating system until I delete the data itself with a Docker volume RM. And that's when that data goes away.
Thanks, Anthony. This is really powerful stuff. And I think, two really cool things, just to name a few from what you just did is one, you were able to basically install and deploy SQL Server twice in, less than a minute, which is just insane as it is. And two, you were able to upgrade that maybe took like 5-10 seconds to upgrade to the newer version of SQL Server 2019. So those are two things that we talked about going fast, and this is definitely going to help you go much faster.
Yeah, thinking about the scenario where maybe you have a query that you're working with that operates or functions different in a different version of SQL Server, or you need to test your application on a new version, and having that functionality to be able to move between versions so quickly. It's a real enabling feature of this technology.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Anthony. We really enjoyed it. We're going to put some references to this notebook that you can try out for yourself, as well as the documentation. And if you like this video, please like this video and leave us a comment of what you're doing with containers. And in the next video, we're going to stick around with Anthony and learn about SQL Server 2019 in Kubernetes. So taking it really to the next level. So we hope you stick around, and we'll see you next time in Data Exposed.